So we are in still the first third of the 19th century. And also some of these things that we're going to discuss will be still occurring during the beginning of the Civil War in 1860. But chapter 12 deals with, if you've started the chapter yet, the 3 R's: religion, romanticism, and reform. And so we're kind of looking at a subsection of American life that was occurring during the Jacksonian period politically. The forced removal of Native Americans to the Indian Territory, the increasing sectional hostility between the North and South, with sharp features in each area, the North having clear industrialization, factories, mills, small farms, and larger urban areas where people worked. And then the South, remember, being still primarily agricultural with large plantations. Cotton is now the staple crop, and it is all on the back of slavery. And we will discuss this with the chapter 14 material on the Civil War. But just to kind of get you prepared for it, the North will, the North is, all the northern states now have outlawed slavery, and it's moving from being just a political issue where you're having more and more people speak against it as a moral evil. So abolitionists are rising up and denouncing slavery. And so the North is moving towards a mindset of, we need to outlaw slavery. We need to get rid of it. It's a plague on the nation. The South, and remember, this is their mindset. This is, we have a totally different 21st century mindset today. I don't know if you guys keep up with the news any, but we even have some of our national leaders talking about making financial reparations to people, to African Americans whose families were slaves, paying money to the ancestors of slaves. But you don't hear them talking about paying money to the ancestors of indentured servants, right? So we have a totally different mindset. And again, don't get me wrong, we see slavery as an evil. It's not right to own another person. But back then, they had a different mindset that was shaped by their culture, the Bible, and the Enlightenment. So while the North is seeing slavery now as a moral issue. It's an evil that's got to be gotten rid of. The South, what they're defending going into the Civil War is it's not an issue just about slavery, it's about state rights. Remember, the South continued to emphasize the rights of states, and they felt like state rights were more important than a federal government. And they see the North as the North, where the capital was, they see the North encroaching on their state rights. Now, what was the biggest institution that the South had? Slavery. So it was the biggest key for the Civil War. It was the largest individual component of state rights. But the South, their mentality was, we're going to war against a northern federal government that's becoming more and more like Britain, more tyrannical. And we've got to protect our state rights, which included this institution, this peculiar institution that our whole livelihood is based on. So keep that in mind when we get to chapter 14. But I chased that little rabbit, kind of got into a large rabbit, didn't it? I chased that rabbit because as we talk about this information in chapter 12 about religion and Romanticism and reform, a part of that is there's a dividing among ministers and churches about the morality or immorality of slavery. You guys know that you have pastors in the North preaching against slavery using the Bible. You have pastors in the South using the same Bible to preach for slavery. So this is going to be a part of that. So let's talk about, for a few minutes, and then after the break, we'll watch a short video on the Second Great Awakening. But let's talk about the changing developments concerning religion in the young republic in the first third of the 19th century. So you'll recall that you had Puritans dominating the New England states, and the Puritans were Calvinistic in their theology, their beliefs, which simply means if you were a Calvinist, you believed that God had selected a few to be saved, and they were called the elect. And so that is the belief of Calvinists. A few were selected to be saved. Everybody else was rejected or not chosen, would probably be a better way to say it. They were not chosen, and there's nothing they can do about it. There's no free will in the Calvinist position. So that was the Puritans of New England. And primarily in that area, the main denomination was Congregationalists. In Rhode Island, you would have had, remember it being the cesspool of New England, right? Because it offered religious freedom. You would have some Baptists there, some Anglicans, maybe some Quakers. And a lot of them, too, would have a Calvinist worldview. And then Pennsylvania would be known as a Quaker state because it was founded to be a refuge primarily for Quakers, but it also offered religious freedom. Maryland was an Anglican, Maryland was a Catholic state. I believe New York was the Anglican or Episcopal state was New York. The Episcopal religion in America is the same as the Anglican religion in England. They're the same thing. The Anglican Church is the Church of England. And what they were called in America was Episcopalian. So, but here's what happened in the first part of the 19th century with religion. You had an increasing number of people who were deists, D-E-I-S-T, deists. And several of our founding fathers were deists, people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. And a deist is a person who believes in a God, but they believe more in a God who is a rational being. Here is the primary example of the deists. They would use the analogy that God is like a watchmaker. A watchmaker designs the watch and then builds the watch, gets all the parts working, and then sells the watch. For the deists, God was like a watchmaker. He was the creator who created everything. He also appointed laws of nature like gravity, thermodynamics. Of course, they wouldn't have known about that back then, but all of the laws of nature, the planets rotating around the sun, you know, they're also in the scientific revolution. So they're learning these things. And so the creator designed the earth, designed the universe, put it in motion, and then he basically let it go and do its own thing. And so the deists did not believe that God was involved in our world like in a supernatural way. He simply created us and gave us the laws of nature, and now he's off doing his own thing wherever. So that was deism. Deism was a very rational branch of religion that put high priority in science and reason. They were very skeptical of miracles that were in the Bible. Matter of fact, you've probably heard that Thomas Jefferson developed his own New Testament. And basically what he did was he went through the whole New Testament because Jefferson believed that Jesus' teachings were fantastic. His teachings on loving your neighbor and all of his ethical teachings were great. If people lived by them, we would have a great society. But he did not believe in the miracles. And so what he did was he cut out all those things out of his New Testament. So deists were very skeptical of supernaturalism, anything that could not be explained by natural law. So-called miracles, they were very skeptical, and they questioned that. But they also were staunch defenders of free speech. Remember, Jefferson in Virginia, he developed that state's document on religious freedom, which was something that Madison used for the Bill of Rights. So Jefferson believed that in a free society where everybody was free to believe as they pleased, they could believe in any religion they wanted to or no religion at all. They would not do any harm to him if he had an atheist as a neighbor, as long as they obeyed the laws. If you have people starting to break the laws of the land, then they're a threat to liberty and they must be brought to justice. But for people to simply believe differently was not a threat to a deist. So that really had an influence in the young republic. Any questions before we take a short break? And here's one other thing that we need to know about deism, along with these others that we're going to talk about. Under the Calvinist theological viewpoint, humans were depraved and innately sinful. I mean, everybody's born a sinner. And they're utterly depraved and they do not seek God, and there's nothing they can do to save themselves. But God has chosen a select few who will be saved. The deists did not look at human nature in such a negative way. They believed that humanity was essentially good and was capable of improving as they learned and made scientific advancements, and could improve society. So that's a big major difference. All right, I've got 10:14, so let's take a 6-minute break and pick back up at 10:20. So Ethan, when would be a good time for you to take the test? Or Caleb, when would be a good time for you to take the test?
Well, Ethan's here now too.
Yeah, I couldn't find my keys this morning. It took me forever.
If you guys want to take it today and you can get a supervisor, that's fine, or tomorrow, whatever.
I don't know where Danielle is. If you'd rather us take it when we're all here, or we can just
okay.
It's whatever is good with you.
It doesn't matter to me, really. You guys want to schedule it for tomorrow? Can you have an hour where you can do that, or an hour and a half?
Yeah, 5th hour.
That works for us.
Okay, what's that time frame?
It starts at 12:30.
5th hour? 12:30.
Starts at 12:30. 5th hour does.
12:30, and it goes till
1:30.
Is that enough time? I can have it available before 12:30.
Yeah, because that's right after we eat lunch. So if we get done eating lunch, we can just go ahead and come in here.
All right, so I'll have it available at 12:15, and it's open book this time.
All right.
So chapters 8 through 11. But I also put a short video. No, I'm sorry. I have another American history class, which is an 8-week version of your class. And so I'm behind a little bit. So those of you that took the test, was there anything in the slides that I told you to know? I've already forgot. Roland or Muldrow or Smithville, was there anything in the slides, like, the second test I wanted you to know that timeline of the revolution.
The only thing was the Jacksonian democracy details.
Okay. So did you hear that, Spyro? Know the details of Jacksonian democracy, which there should be some slides that give you some more details.
Okay.
But other than that, it's open book. And so it'll be ready at 12:15 tomorrow. You'll have till 1:30.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. So we got 3 more minutes. I gotta go get a banana. All right, we're back. So you had a couple new denominations pop up, which would be characterized under the umbrella of Christianity, because you wouldn't put deism under Christianity. But, and keep in mind that America is really a, you know, you've probably heard the expression, America's a melting pot for nationalities to come in, like the Irish, the German, the Russians, the Italians. come to our country, and it's a melting pot where we all become Americans. Well, you also kind of had hybrid. Remember we were kind of a hybrid politically, because we had in the New England territories, you had town meetings. You had more, of course, back then, white males getting the ability to vote, even though they didn't own land. You had more democratic expressions of government cropping up, and it led to the Revolution and the Constitution. And there was a merging of all of the American innovations with the Enlightenment philosophers that believed in natural rights and government being a contract of the people. Well, this started to seep over into religious thinking. So the Christian denominations through the Revolutionary period and up into this first part of the 19th century were strongly Calvinist. And it kind of mirrored English society. Remember the pyramid? You had the few that were wealthy at the top, and then the majority of the people were lower class, and you didn't cross those lines. Well, in religion, Calvinist, you had the elect, which were a few, and then everyone else who was not chosen. So these democratic principles start seeping into people's religious thinking. And with the rise of deism, promoting science and the goodness of humanity, you had two unique denominations emerge. Now, today, mainstream Christians would not consider these denominations Christian, but they fall under the Christian umbrella. You had what was called the Unitarians. And this is page 388, 389 of your text if you want to follow along. But the Unitarians, the second group is Universalists. They both begin with U-N-I, but Unitarianism begins with the word unit, U-N-I-T. And that's just a little handy way to help you remember that the Unitarians believed God was a unity, one. And this is a departure from the Calvinists who believed God was a tri-unity or a trinity. The Calvinists had their belief in God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, three in one. The Unitarians said, no, God is just a unity. There's not a tri-unity in God. Unitarians stressed the compassion of a loving God as opposed to an angry God under Calvinism who, an example, Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. In that sermon, Edwards says that just as a man can hold a spider over the fire, he has a hold of the spider's web and he's swinging that spider over the fire and he can drop that spider at any moment. God holds sinners in his hands and he can send them to hell at any moment that he wants to because he's angry with people. So Unitarians stressed that God was a loving God. They also stressed that, as opposed to Calvinism, that man was essentially evil and depraved, they stressed the natural goodness of mankind. And the Unitarians believed that having a demeanor of calm, rational reason was much more superior to the emotional forms of worship in traditional Christian churches. So therefore, Unitarians did not believe that Jesus was divine, but he was simply a very good, saintly man. And similar to the deists, or especially Thomas Jefferson, if people would follow the ethical teachings of Jesus, it would do a lot of good in society. Unitarians really flourished in the Boston area and all of New England, but really in Boston. They never became a large denomination, but they did attract those that had the best educations and those that also had those that were the wealthiest, which that makes sense if you think about it, because they studied science, they studied the classics and other areas of learning, and they probably felt like their wealth was to be used to do good. So that's Unitarianism. You'll want to know that for the test. And by the way, you'll also want to know deism. And then the third group that I want to discuss that really cropped up in this time are the Universalists. Now today, Universalists believe that everyone will ultimately be saved. But when they first began, it was more of an emphasis on salvation being available to everyone, not just to those that were predestined. So it was universalism. The main tenets of universalism is that God is too merciful and loving to condemn anyone to eternal punishment. And so really, in a sense, the Universalists and Unitarians were in agreement. The Universalists said that God was too good to damn anyone. The Unitarians insisted that man was too good to be damned. So, Universalists and Unitarians. And they would have been much different. The big difference from the deists was the sacred texts for deists would be the scientific writings of John Locke and Sir Isaac Newton and Copernicus, whereas the Unitarians and Universalists, they still would have kept the Bible as their sacred text. So really, all three groups got away from emotionalism and moved to reason. All three groups moved away from the sinfulness of man to the goodness of man. The key difference would be the deists saw God not as the biblical God, but simply as a rational being. And the Unitarians and Universalists simply felt like the biblical God was his love and his compassion would supersede and trump his anger and wrath. Any questions on that? Are we having fun yet? All right, we're not going to get to our film, but let's talk a little bit about the Second Great Awakening. We didn't talk a lot about the First Great Awakening, but that happened in the 1720s and 1730s primarily, with a little bit going into the 1740s. And it was a great awakening in which the religions of America were, primarily, dominantly Calvinist. And the big preachers for the First Great Awakening were Jonathan Edwards, Gilbert Tennent, George Whitefield. All three of them strong, staunch Calvinists. The Second Great Awakening was also a period that began around 1800, and it was a massive wave of religious revivalism. The First Great Awakening, there were revivals, but with Jonathan Edwards there was always a restraining element of, we don't want emotions to take over our Great Awakening. We want to make sure everything lines up with Scripture. Jonathan Edwards, probably considered among not only one of the greatest preachers ever, but probably one of America's greatest philosophers, very rational. But the Second Great Awakening was, we can just say, it was predominantly a revivalism of emotionalism. Emotions, experiences, physical manifestations. And so it greatly differed in that aspect from the First Great Awakening. And I believe a part of it was the elements of democracy that were in our political realm coming over into the religious realm. Clergy, and it started in the First Great Awakening, but it was really prevalent in the Second Great Awakening. Clergy, or the ministers, they were not really that much more elevated than the lay people. That's a good dance move, whoever that was. But anyway, lay people had much more influence in their churches. They were more involved in church life. They could even dismiss their pastors if they wanted to. And they longed for a religion that just wasn't highly rational, but they really wanted a religion with deep feelings deep emotional connections, experiences. So the Second Great Awakening really happened prominently in the New England and Middle colonies and moved westward into Ohio and Kentucky. And it really was a spread of especially two denominations, the Methodists and the Baptists. For example, this is on your textbook on page 389. In 1780, there were only 50 Methodist churches in America. By 1860, there were 20,000 Methodist churches. And also, the Second Great Awakening had kind of two centers of activity. The first center of activity was that happened on a lot of the college campuses that began in New England, but then went into Pennsylvania, Ohio. All of our Ivy League schools, except for Penn, but Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Dartmouth and Cornell, those universities were all started as schools for ministers. And these schools experienced a wave of revivalism that had a great effect on those that were going to school to be ministers. The other group that was highly affected by this was the rural folks in backwoods Tennessee and Kentucky. And the revival fires really spread greatly there. And these frontier revivals were best characterized by what was called tent meetings. And you still have some churches today that will have an old-fashioned tent revival. But the people in the area would go and they would bring their tents and they would set up and they would live there for more than a week. And there would be all kinds of preachers preaching all the time. And you had European preachers, you had African American preachers, you had woman preachers. You had all kinds of people, all kinds of preachers, and they would seek emotional experiences, intense physical manifestations of the Spirit. And these tent meetings became very popular. You'll want to know, and this is on page 391, the first camp meeting occurred in 1801 at a place called Cane Ridge. So think back to 1801 as we close today. 10,000 people show up for this revival. And it was most likely out in the field or in an open area surrounded by trees. This camp meeting was very, very exceptional. 10,000 people in 1801. And so these frontier revivals, these tent meetings, were highly prominent at that time. And also, as we end for the day, you had the emerging of the circuit rider preachers. These would be preachers that would ride on horseback and preach in many different towns and would travel thousands of miles to do so. And you also had the rising up of the evangelists. the preaching evangelists, the traveling evangelists. Many of those circuit riding preachers would pastor churches, but the traveling evangelists would go and preach from town to town. So we'll pick up there on Tuesday. On Thursday. Are there any questions? All right, so for Evie in Roland, you'll be able to access quiz 1 tonight. Everybody else will have access to the first quiz tomorrow night. And then Spyro, your test will be, test 3 will be tomorrow at 12:15.
Sounds good.
So make sure you let your lady or gentleman know who's your proctor.
I will.
All right, we will see you Thursday. Have a great Wednesday tomorrow.
See ya.
Bye-bye.